October 5th, 1943. The sun had not yet crested the smoky horizon of the Ruhr Valley, but the airfield at RAF Falmere, Cambridgeshire, was already alive with the mechanical hum of P-38 Lightnings. Servicemen moved with precise choreography, treads scraping gravel, metal on metal as ground crews prepared the twin-engine fighters for another day over the heart of Nazi industrial Germany. Frost still clung to the wings, rivulets of condensation forming over the bright aluminum fuselages, yet the chill of early morning could not dampen the anticipation, or the tension, that gripped the pilots and gunners. Captain James Jimmy Caldwell, a 28-year-old flight leader of the 339th Fighter Squadron, stood by his Lightning, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The bitter taste did nothing to ease the nerves knotted in his stomach. Today's mission was straightforward on paper. Escort the 8th Air Force bombers en route to the Krupp munitions factories, one of the largest production centres in the Reich. In practice, it was anything but simple. German air defences were sophisticated, relentless, and now emboldened after months of attrition. Every sortie meant risk of death, or worse, being captured behind enemy lines. Caldwell's squadron had trained relentlessly in the months leading up to this point. Each P-38 had been calibrated, engines double-checked, gun sight optics aligned to fractions of a degree. Gunners, though less heralded than the pilots themselves, had undergone hours of simulated fire drills in both open and enclosed mock-up turrets, learning to trust instinct as much as aim. Today, those instincts would be tested against the Luftwaffe's finest. Focke-Wulf Fw-190s with their ferocious firepower, nimble and deadly, and the ubiquitous Messerschmitt Bf-109s, whose pilots were trained in the precise, lethal art of dogfighting. First, Lieutenant Harold Hawk Donnelly walked past Caldwell, slinging his flight bag over his shoulder. Hawk was 23, a cadet with nerves hardened by 6 months of combat over occupied France. He had a reputation among his peers for both audacity and a peculiar calm under fire. "Caldwell," he said, voice low but steady. "Weather's holding. Sun's clear enough for visual formation, but we'll be in the shadow of flak soon. Hope your boys are ready." Caldwell nodded, glancing toward the other pilots assembling for final checks. Lieutenant Marcus Finnegan, a meticulous pilot from Pennsylvania, crouched beside his Lightning, inspecting the nose-mounted .50 caliber guns. Finnegan had been called obsessive by ground crews, but his kill ratio spoke for itself. "These guns are ready to scream," Finnegan muttered, tapping the barrels like a pianist testing keys. He was joined by Sergeant First Class Robert Bobby Simmons, a veteran gunner who had been transferred to the 339th after 2 tours as a bomber turret specialist. Simmons's hands moved over the ammunition belts with practiced ease, eyes scanning the horizon beyond the airfield, imagining the waves of German fighters waiting to strike. By 0630 hours, the 339th's 20 P-38s were taxiing down the frost-lined runway, engines growling in unison. The formation took shape like a living organism, precision honed through months of training, yet flexible enough to respond to the chaos that awaited them over the Ruhr. The bombers they would escort, a formation of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, had already lifted off from their staging bases, trailing contrails that glittered in the dim dawn. Overhead, reconnaissance aircraft had reported pockets of Luftwaffe activity, the remnants of night fighters and radar-controlled interceptors poised to disrupt the raid. As Caldwell climbed into his cockpit, he reflected on the tactical doctrine drilled into him. The P-38s would fly in a combat box formation alongside the bombers, providing overlapping fields of fire. Yet doctrine could only take them so far. Combat was unpredictable. Pilots and gunners alike had learned to rely on gut instinct, rapid-fire decision-making, and above all, the ability to maintain cohesion under pressure. The Ruhr had become a crucible, and today would test them like no training exercise could. Overhead, the engines of the P-38s whined as they ascended through the clouds, the roar of 20 fighters echoing across the airfield like a metallic storm. Caldwell felt the vibration through the rudder pedals, the subtle shifts in throttle as his wingmen fell into their assigned positions. Below, the patchwork of European countryside shrank into a grid of rivers and industrial complexes, smoke rising from factories in long, lazy columns. This was the territory they would fight over, a landscape scarred by war and industry alike. Even as they approached the edge of occupied territory, tension thickened. The gunners tightened their grips on their mounts, eyes scanning every inch of sky. Every shadow, every flicker of movement could be the telltale sign of an Fw-190 diving into attack. Caldwell caught himself thinking of his younger brother, still in Kansas, unaware of the horrors unfolding in Europe. A pang of guilt twisted in his gut. Survival often meant leaving others behind. Lieutenant Donnelly, seated 3 planes to Caldwell's right, broke the tense silence. "Eyes open, boys. They'll be out there. Remember your drills. Don't hesitate." His words, clipped and matter-of-fact, carried the weight of experience, a subtle acknowledgement that fear was inevitable, but discipline and instinct were non-negotiable. Below them, the Ruhr's factories churned relentlessly. The clamour of war was already beginning long before the first shots had been fired. Anti-aircraft emplacements were ready, radar operators had locked onto the approaching American formation, and Luftwaffe pilots, some as young as 17, were climbing into their Fw-190s and Bf-109s, unaware that they were about to encounter a storm of steel unlike anything they had imagined. Caldwell's eyes flicked to the horizon, where the rising sun glinted off distant clouds. He knew that in a matter of minutes the air would erupt in a cacophony of gunfire, metal tearing metal, and the screams of both man and machine. For the 339th Fighter Squadron, there would be no room for hesitation. Lives, planes, and the success of the mission depended on split-second decisions and on the ability of each gunner and pilot to act instinctively, trusting both training and their own unflinching courage. In the cockpit, hands clenched around the controls, Caldwell exhaled, feeling the familiar mix of fear and resolve. Somewhere in the distance, the Luftwaffe was preparing. And soon, very soon, the sky over the Ruhr would become a battlefield where instincts and metal would collide with deadly precision, or brutal randomness. The first challenge of the day was only minutes away, and when it came, American gunners, trained to aim but often firing in sheer instinct, would prove that sometimes chaos itself could be the deadliest weapon. By 0725 hours, the 339th Fighter Squadron had crossed the Belgian border, the industrial sprawl of the Ruhr looming ahead. The sun had fully risen, casting a pale orange hue over the patchwork of factories, rivers, and rail yards. Through the cockpit glass, Caldwell could see the first black dots climbing in the distance. Luftwaffe fighters alerted by early warning radar, diving from their altitude with lethal precision. Lieutenant Donnelly was first to spot them, the glint of Fw-190's breaking formation above the morning clouds. "Bandits at 10 o'clock high!" he shouted over the intercom, voice taut with urgency. The formation tightened instinctively, bombers in the centre, P-38s forming protective wedges on every side. Gunners gripped their mounts, fingers brushing triggers, as though drawing courage from the cold steel beneath their hands. It happened faster than any of them could anticipate. Without hesitation, the German fighters surged, wings slicing through the sky like predatory birds. The first burst of machine gun fire tore through the air, tracer rounds streaking toward the bombers. Ground crews, men who had seen the mission take off hours before, would later describe the echo of the guns as a metallic scream, almost alive. Caldwell's P-38 pitched and rolled, pulling into a defensive arc, twin .50 caliber guns already hot. The 339th's tactical doctrine emphasized escort precision, but the reality of combat forced an improvisation that would soon define the mission. Gunners, trained to aim carefully, now fired instinctively, sweeping their barrels across the sky with a deadly abandon. Sergeant Simmons, stationed in the rear turret of one of the modified Lightnings, recounted later that the first few moments were a blur. "I wasn't aiming so much as reacting. Every fighter that popped into view was gone before I could think twice. It was just trigger, breathe, trigger again." His account was corroborated by Lieutenant Finnegan, who later wrote in the squadron diary, "We had drilled for this, yes, but nothing in training could prepare you for the sheer speed of a 190 diving headlong at a bomber. By the time you lined up the sights, it was often already too late." The Luftwaffe's opening salvo struck with deadly intent. A B-17 at the rear of the formation took hits to its port engine, smoke spiralling into the sky. Yet even as chaos erupted, the American fighters responded with an almost preternatural coordination. P-38s swooped in from multiple angles, gunners firing in a controlled frenzy. Tracers lanced across the morning air, shredding the fabric of the Fw-190s wings and fuselages. Witnesses later described the scene as apocalyptic. "It was like the sky itself was on fire," recalled a bomber pilot from the 303rd Bomb Group. "You couldn't tell which way to look without seeing enemy aircraft smoking, breaking apart, falling like stones." The 339th's gunners, acting without the luxury of perfect aim, had nonetheless created a deadly crossfire. Within moments, German fighters began spiraling out of control, the precision of their dive and climb negated by sheer volume and instinctive fire from the American Lightnings. Caldwell manoeuvred aggressively, banking left to draw off an attacking Bf-109. His .50 caliber guns spat tracer rounds that tore into the 109's fuselage, smoke curling from its engine. The German pilot attempted evasive rolls, but the concentrated fire of gunners from 3 different P-38s forced a fatal miscalculation. The 109's wings twisted under the barrage. It went down in a plume of fire, pieces of metal scattering over the Ruhr countryside. Lieutenant Donnelly, flying just a few hundred meters above Caldwell, had a similar encounter. 2 Fw-109s approached in a coordinated dive, banking sharply to flank the bombers. Donnelly's P-38 responded automatically. His gunners opened fire without hesitation. Tracers crisscrossed the sky, and in seconds, one 190 tumbled violently before disappearing into the fields below, the second breaking off under the concentrated assault. The initial moments of engagement revealed an unexpected pattern. Instinctive firing, guns unleashed without deliberate targeting, was producing higher kill efficiency than the squadron had anticipated. Combat reports later detailed that within the first 5 minutes of engagement, gunners from the 339th downed 7 enemy aircraft, several without the pilots even seeing their opponents clearly. The speed of combat left no time for meticulous aiming. Training had conditioned reflexes to the point that instinct alone became deadly precision. Below, bomber gunners also contributed, their overlapping fields of fire creating a lethal shield. B-17 tail gunners, initially nervous about the P-38s moving into protective positions, found themselves coordinating fire patterns with the fighter escorts. Tracers intersected mid-air, bullets from multiple calibers tearing into the attacking Fw-190s with astonishing effect. The Germans, trained for disciplined dogfights, were now being shredded by a volume of fire that exceeded any single formation's expectation. The chaos of the moment brought individual heroism into stark relief. Sergeant Simmons later recalled a brief lull in the melee when a lone 109 attempted a high-speed pass over the top of the formation. "I didn't even have time to aim. I just let the belt go. The 109 rolled, smoke trailing like a comet, and that was that. I swear I didn't even see where the bullets hit. It was over before I could blink." Across the formation, similar accounts emerged. Instinctive, unplanned firing was devastating the Luftwaffe. For Caldwell, the thrill of survival was inseparable from the weight of responsibility. "We weren't just flying, we were executing a ballet of death," he later wrote in the squadron log. Every decision, every twitch of the stick had consequences not just for ourselves, but for the bombers we swore to protect. And in those first minutes, instinct became our greatest weapon. Within 20 minutes, the formation had reached the outskirts of the Ruhr's primary industrial complex. German resistance had begun to thin, many fighters either destroyed or retreating to regroup. The gunners' fire, chaotic yet precise in its own way, had set the tone for the day. Several bombers had minor damage, but the majority continued toward the target, a testament to the effectiveness of the squadron's combined reflexive firepower and coordinated maneuvering. As the smoke cleared from the initial clash, Caldwell allowed himself a brief glance at the horizon. The Ruhr lay ahead, factories belching smoke, flak towers bristling with guns. Yet for the moment, the sky belonged to the Americans. The 339th had proven a lesson. Even without deliberate aiming, disciplined instinct and coordinated action could turn chaos into victory. The first engagement over the Ruhr ended with staggering results. At least 10 German fighters confirmed destroyed within minutes, more likely damaged beyond repair. Reports would later note that the American gunners' reflexive firing, what some would call reckless, was in fact a tactical innovation born of necessity, a brutal improvisational method that saved bombers and shocked the Luftwaffe. Caldwell tightened his grip on the controls, eyes scanning the horizon for the next wave. "Don't get complacent," he muttered into the intercom. "This is just the beginning." The Ruhr would not yield easily, and the skies were far from safe. By 0830 hours, the formation had penetrated deep into the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. Below, smoke and steam from factories and coke ovens blurred the landscape into a grim mosaic of grey and black. The steady hum of P-38 engines was suddenly punctuated by the staccato burst of anti-aircraft fire. Flak 88s, precise and merciless, lighting up the sky with their signature green tracers. Lieutenant Caldwell adjusted his flight path, weaving through the barrage, his twin .50 caliber guns ready to respond, though their primary task now was defensive, keeping bombers safe from both Luftwaffe fighters and the deadly verticals of German flak. The 339th had trained for evasive maneuvers, yet nothing could truly replicate the thudding impact of hundreds of shells exploding around a fragile aluminum frame. Sergeant Simmons peered through the rear turret, counting the tracers as they streaked past. "Every explosion felt like it was inside the plane," he said later. "You could see pieces of flak shrapnel bouncing off the fuselage. Some of the B-17s were hit right in the engines, and you could smell the smoke before anyone called it over the intercom." The Luftwaffe, though battered from the initial skirmish, had not abandoned the bombers. From above and behind, Fw-190s and Bf-109s returned, diving in from multiple angles. The American gunners had little time to aim. Instinct now ruled supreme. Tracer fire intersected across the sky, cutting through clouds and smoke like a web of lethal light. Within seconds, German fighters were again spiraling downward in flames, their pilots forced to eject or crash land. The combination of instinctive gunfire and aggressive maneuvering was proving devastating. Combat reports would later note that the squadron's kill-to-loss ratio during this mission was extraordinary, in part because American gunners did not wait to take perfect shots. Instead, they fired continuously, sweeping across approaching fighters, creating a volume of fire impossible to evade. Bombers pressed on, but the German flak proved relentless. One B-17 took a near-direct hit in the left wing, causing it to shudder violently. The pilot, Captain Harkins, struggled to maintain altitude, smoke trailing from the engine nacelle. Caldwell swung his P-38 in a protective arc, laying down a wall of bullets at the closest enemy fighter threatening the damaged bomber. Instinctive, uncontrolled firing saved Harkins's crew from a potential finishing strike. The formation's radio buzzed with a cacophony of shouted commands, mechanical warnings, and intercom chatter. Bandits, port side. Flak, 3 o'clock low. Pull up, pull up. The P-38s twisted through the sky, sometimes in perfect formation, often in chaotic improvisation, as gunners fired indiscriminately yet effectively. Lieutenant Donnelly later described it as the most terrifying ballet of destruction I've ever flown. One particularly harrowing moment occurred over the city of Essen. Anti-aircraft fire was concentrated around the Krupp steel works, creating a vertical corridor of death. Bombers held steady, but the P-38s were forced to dive, roll and climb through a lattice of tracer fire and exploding shells. A gunner's instinctive reaction became life-saving. Without aiming, their belts of .50 caliber rounds cut down incoming Fw-190s before they could close in on the bombers. Caldwell saw one fighter pilot, barely able to maintain control of his damaged aircraft, descend rapidly toward the industrial complex. Simmons fired again, instinctively releasing a burst that tore through the tail assembly of the enemy plane. The German fighter spiraled downward, its wings crumpling under concentrated fire, crashing amidst the factories below. Caldwell allowed himself no satisfaction, only focus. Another formation of enemy planes was closing fast. Amid the chaos, minor miracles occurred. Bombers with damaged engines limped along, shielded by P-38s, whose gunners never stopped firing. "We had to trust our instincts," recalled Lieutenant Finnegan. "There wasn't time to think." The plane in front of you, the one you swore you'd protect, depended on it. Each burst of uncontrolled gunfire shredded another attacking aircraft, and yet every flak explosion reminded pilots of the razor-thin line between survival and destruction. Meanwhile, ground observers later reported the sky above Essen as a living battlefield. Smoke plumes from both bombers and German fighters rose, punctuated by the fiery explosions of anti-aircraft rounds. The 339th Fighter Squadron's unorthodox method, firing without aiming, relying on reaction and volume, had turned the engagement into a nightmare for the Luftwaffe. Entire squadrons were decimated, many pilots later captured in post-war interrogations, noting that the American gunners' firing was relentless, precise in its own chaotic way. As the formation approached its primary target, a heavily defended steel mill producing armaments, the Luftwaffe shifted tactics, attempting to flank from multiple directions. Caldwell and his squadron responded with what would become an iconic maneuver: instinctive crossfire. P-38s twisted through the sky, firing in overlapping patterns that left no clear avenue for the German fighters to penetrate. Each burst was unpredictable yet devastating, shredding wings, tearing fuselages, and sending pilots into emergency spins. By 0900 hours, the Ruhr mission had passed its most intense phase. German air resistance had been broken, though not without cost. Several bombers sustained serious damage. A few P-38s required emergency landings upon returning to base. Yet the instinctive firing, combined with disciplined maneuvering, had saved dozens of lives and ensured the majority of the bombers reached their target. Caldwell allowed himself a moment of grim reflection. The sky was a battlefield of chaos, fire, and steel, he would later write. And yet, in the midst of it all, we discovered a truth that training alone could not teach. Instinct, courage, and unhesitating action could turn the tide of battle. In post-mission reports, the 339th Fighter Squadron documented at least 12 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed in the Ruhr airspace, several more probable. German records corroborated significant losses among Fw-190s and Bf-109s, with surviving pilots later describing the American gunners' reflexive fire as unrelenting and overwhelming. The air over the Ruhr quieted as the formation began its return to England, but the echoes of destruction lingered. For the men of the 339th, the day would be remembered not just for the destruction wrought, but for the improvisational courage that saved lives, redefined aerial tactics, and left the Luftwaffe reeling. Even as engines hummed and the horizon of the North Sea approached, the pilots knew the war above Germany was far from over. Flak, fighters, and the unpredictable chaos of battle awaited them in every sortie. But now they had proven a lethal truth. Sometimes aiming is secondary to action, and instinct can be the deadliest weapon of all. By late morning, the 339th Fighter Squadron was regrouping over the clouded English Channel, wings slick with fuel and streaked with battle residue. The Ruhr mission had tested every ounce of training, instinct, and courage of the pilots and gunners alike. Yet there was no time to dwell on what had just occurred. The Luftwaffe, though battered, was adaptive, and intelligence suggested a counterstrike was already mobilizing. Captain Caldwell, wings level, scanned the horizon with a practiced eye. The distinctive silhouettes of German fighters appeared as faint specks against the pale blue sky, their approach swift and deliberate. The previous engagement had taught the Americans an invaluable lesson. The Luftwaffe had not yet exhausted its cunning. Now the onus was on anticipation, coordination, and disciplined aggression. Lieutenant Donnelly adjusted his throttle, feeling the familiar vibrations of the P-38. "They're not going to give up easily," he muttered, more to himself than the men on the radio. Simmons, still catching his breath from the flak-laced Ruhr, replied, "Doesn't matter. We've seen what we can do if we trust our instincts." The statement, casual though it sounded, carried the weight of hard-earned experience. As the German formation drew closer, the P-38s descended in tactical echelon, creating a defensive shield around the returning bombers. The Luftwaffe had clearly learned from their earlier losses. They split into smaller, more aggressive attack groups, attempting to exploit gaps in the American formation. But the 339th was ready. Each pilot had internalized the chaos of instinctive firing. Gunners unleashed continuous bursts, their aim less precise but devastating in volume. In the first wave, a squadron of Fw-190s dove from the sun, hoping to catch the bombers off guard. Tracer fire crisscrossed the sky, striking fuselage and wing alike. One Fw-190 went down in a spiral of smoke and flame, its pilot ejecting into the grey cloud bank. Another attempted to flank from below, only to be shredded by a concentrated burst from 3 converging P-38s. The Americans' approach, fire first, assess later, was proving even more effective in a defensive counter. The Germans adapted quickly, however, and chaos erupted anew. Bf-109s swooped in low, weaving between flak bursts and American formations. Captain Caldwell barked commands into the radio, directing his flight into crossfire patterns designed to intercept incoming threats. "Left flank, cover the bombers. Simmons, Donnelly, engage high." The coordination was a delicate dance, a blend of rehearsed maneuvers and split-second improvisation. Bombers, already fatigued from the Ruhr assault, held formation with grim determination. The flak below had been reduced temporarily by the earlier damage assessment, yet the Luftwaffe's remaining fighters sought to exploit any vulnerability. One particularly agile Fw-190 attempted a head-on attack against a damaged B-17. Instinctive fire from Caldwell's .50 calibers tore through the enemy's cockpit and wings, forcing it into an uncontrolled descent. The bomber, momentarily shielded, pressed forward under heavy protection. Amid the aerial tumult, the squadron began to notice a pattern. The German fighters were increasingly hesitant, reacting to the unrelenting American gunners. The instinctive firing, though chaotic and indiscriminate in appearance, had created a psychological barrier. Pilots would later testify that the American response felt relentless, uncalculated, yet impossibly accurate. It was a paradox of chaos creating control, of volume creating precision. Lieutenant Finnegan spotted a Bf-109 attempting to circle behind the formation. "I've got it!" he shouted. Without hesitation, he opened fire, tracer rounds striking the enemy fighter's fuselage. The aircraft shuddered violently, smoke trailing from the engine, and spiraled down toward the industrial outskirts below. For the Americans, each successful engagement reinforced the effectiveness of instinctive, high-volume fire. The Luftwaffe, recognizing the threat, shifted tactics once more. They began feint attacks and sudden dives, trying to scatter the squadron. Yet every movement was countered by overlapping fields of fire, with gunners responding not through precise aiming, but through rapid reflexive bursts. Sergeant Simmons later recounted that it was like the air itself became a shield for the bombers. The chaos of our fire forced them into impossible decisions. Over the next 30 minutes, what had begun as a defensive return turned into a controlled offensive. The 339th systematically dismantled the remaining German forces, sending multiple fighters down in spirals of fire. The squadron's P-38s, though slightly damaged and low on ammunition, maintained cohesion. Caldwell, observing the sky littered with enemy wreckage, realized the tide of this engagement had irrevocably turned. By midday, the Luftwaffe's resistance had largely dissipated. Surviving fighters retreated, leaving the bombers to continue toward England under lighter opposition. Yet the cost of engagement was tangible. Several P-38s required emergency landings, minor injuries were reported among gunners, and the pilots bore the psychological scars of relentless close-quarters combat. Post-mission reports emphasized both tactical and psychological lessons. American gunners had discovered the lethal efficacy of instinctive high-volume fire under intense pressure. Enemy combatants would later testify that the Americans' approach was unlike any they had encountered, unpredictable, overwhelming, and devastatingly effective. The battle over the Ruhr and its return leg had not only inflicted substantial losses on the Luftwaffe, but also established a model for instinctive engagement in future escort missions. Caldwell, reflecting in his log, noted the paradoxical nature of instinctive combat. "Precision is a luxury," he wrote. "When the sky is filled with fire and steel, the one who hesitates is lost." Yet even in unmeasured bursts, survival and victory emerge. Our guns spoke when our minds could not, and in that unrelenting voice we found the edge we needed. As the squadron crossed the North Sea, returning to the fog-laden English coastline, the pilots carried more than just fatigue. They carried the proof of a hard-earned truth. In the chaos of the air, instinct and rapid response could overcome even the most formidable opponents. And while each engagement exacted a toll, it also sharpened skills, cemented trust among airmen, and forged a reputation that would echo in debriefings, reports, and post-war accounts for decades. By the time they landed, the 339th had effectively rewritten the understanding of air defense in escort missions. The Luftwaffe's once feared fighters had been shredded not by meticulous aim, but by instinct, reflex, and unyielding courage, a testament to the unpredictability of aerial warfare and the remarkable adaptability of American airmen in the crucible of World War II. By mid-afternoon, the 339th Fighter Squadron had regrouped and was once again climbing toward the dense, smoke-hazed skies over central Germany. The Ruhr engagement had left an indelible mark on every pilot and gunner, yet there was no time to dwell on exhaustion. Intelligence reports indicated that secondary Luftwaffe units were mobilizing to intercept the returning bombers, smaller formations of Fw-190s and Bf-109s, seasoned veterans who had learned from earlier encounters. The sun, angled sharply over the horizon, cast long shadows across the smoke-choked industrial landscape. From above, the bombed-out factories looked like scarred battlefields frozen in time. The P-38s cut through this inferno, their engines roaring in unison, reflecting glints of sunlight off their twin booms. Captain Caldwell's voice crackled through the radio. "Maintain tight formation. Bombers are priority 1. Watch your 6. Lieutenant Donnelly, still feeling the adrenaline from the previous engagement, adjusted his gun sight and scanned the horizon. He noticed faint, fleeting silhouettes of enemy aircraft approaching from the north. The Luftwaffe was attempting another interception, this time using the terrain and industrial smoke as concealment. "They're coming low," he warned over the comms, trying to sneak between the cloud cover. Almost immediately, tracer fire erupted in the distance. German fighters had initiated a coordinated attack, diving through smoke and shadow in an effort to disrupt the bomber formations. The Americans responded instinctively. Gunners on the P-38s unleashed high-volume bursts, aiming less at precise targeting than at creating a lethal zone through which the enemy could not safely fly. The result was devastating. Fw-190s and Bf-109s were shredded mid-dive, engines and wings torn apart by the sheer volume of fire. Sergeant Simmons, manning the rear guns of a P-38, later described the scene as absolute chaos, but somehow we controlled it. Our fingers moved before our brains caught up, and each burst seemed to clear a path for the bombers. Observers would later note that this reflexive method, fire first, adjust later, was becoming a signature tactic of the 339th. Amid the relentless engagement, the bomber formations pressed forward. B-17s and B-24s, though heavily damaged from earlier raids, maintained disciplined lines. One B-17, its fuselage riddled with flak and fighter fire, staggered forward like a wounded giant. Donnelly's P-38 covered its vulnerable right flank, machine guns blazing as he intercepted an Fw-190 attempting a head-on pass. The enemy aircraft shuddered, trailing black smoke, and was forced into a steep spiral away from the formation. As they pushed deeper into German airspace, the squadron began to encounter pockets of resistance that required split-second judgment. One Fw-190 appeared suddenly from below, its attack trajectory aimed at a bomber struggling to maintain altitude. Lieutenant Finnegan, reacting instinctively, opened fire from close range. Tracer rounds tore through the Fw-190's fuselage, igniting its fuel tanks. The fighter spiraled into a nearby factory district, exploding in a shower of fire and metal. Despite the ferocity of the Luftwaffe counterattacks, the Americans' instinctive fire method continued to dominate. Captain Caldwell observed how the enemy seemed increasingly hesitant, unable to anticipate where the next volley would come from. In later debriefings, surviving German pilots would recount the terror of approaching the bombers. It was as though the sky itself was alive with fire. Every direction held death. Meanwhile, the psychological toll on the 339th became apparent. Pilots and gunners were stretched to the limits of human endurance, eyes strained from hours of scanning, fingers stiff from prolonged trigger pressure. Yet camaraderie and trust kept them aligned. When one pilot called for assistance, others moved immediately to cover, forming a protective shield that allowed the bombers to inch forward through the inferno. By late afternoon, the squadron had entered an area of dense anti-aircraft artillery around the Ruhr's southern periphery. Flak bursts punctuated the sky with deafening cracks, sending metal shards toward the bombers and P-38s alike. One near miss shredded the tail assembly of a B-24, forcing its crew to rely entirely on fighter cover. Donnelly, recognizing the imminent threat, directed a flanking maneuver, instinctive fire spraying in all directions. The result was both terrifying and effective. Enemy fighters were neutralized, and the bomber survived the immediate assault. Throughout this engagement, the tactical efficacy of instinctive firing became increasingly clear. Each burst, though seemingly chaotic, created zones of denial for the Luftwaffe, limiting their attack vectors and forcing them into predictable paths of destruction. The P-38s, though fewer in number than the German formations, leveraged their firepower and speed with lethal efficiency. By dusk, the sky over the Ruhr began to clear of enemy fighters. Smoke from industrial targets mingled with the trails of downed aircraft, painting a grisly tableau of the battle. Pilots of the 339th, though exhausted, felt the quiet relief of survival and the grim satisfaction of success. Sergeant Simmons, wiping soot from his visor, muttered, "We made it through the inferno, but only just." The debriefing later that evening emphasized both the human and tactical aspects of the mission. The instinctive, high-volume firing method had proved decisive, preventing significant losses to the bomber formations and neutralizing experienced Luftwaffe pilots. Each member of the squadron had contributed, their reflexes and training melding into a collective force that exceeded expectations. Captain Caldwell, in his report, reflected on the broader significance. "We discovered something fundamental today. Chaos, when harnessed through discipline and instinct, becomes a weapon. The Luftwaffe may have numbers and precision, but our response, immediate, unrelenting, instinctive, has redefined how we engage and survive in the skies above Germany." As night fell over England, the squadron returned to base, engines sputtering with the fatigue of continuous engagement. The P-38s bore scars of metal, flak, and battle, while their crews carried the weight of what they had witnessed. Yet even in exhaustion, there was a shared sense of accomplishment, a hard-won mastery over both machine and chaos, a validation of the instinctive method that had shredded German fighters from the sky. The morning of October 17, 1943, brought a grey, overcast sky over the English Channel. The 339th Fighter Squadron readied for another bomber escort mission, intelligence reporting renewed Luftwaffe activity along the Ruhr corridor. After the previous day's grueling engagements, both pilots and gunners were tense but resolute. Captain Caldwell reviewed the flight plan, emphasizing tight formation and covering the bombers' vulnerable flanks. Lieutenant Donnelly checked his P-38's guns again, the metallic scent of oil and gunpowder still lingering in the cockpit from the prior sortie. Sergeant Simmons, stationed in the rear gunner's position, tightened his straps and ran through his checklist. Every crew member knew the stakes. Escorting the bombers meant exposing themselves to swarms of experienced German pilots, but failing would result in catastrophic bomber losses. As the squadron climbed through low clouds toward German airspace, the horizon began to ripple with movement. Radar reports had indicated Luftwaffe patrols, but nothing could fully prepare them for the sudden onslaught. From the cloud cover emerged a dozen Fw-190s, diving in tight formations, engines screaming. "Bandits at 2 o'clock, Caldwell barked. The reaction was instantaneous. P-38s wheeled, guns blazing before targets were fully acquired. This wasn't careful marksmanship. This was instinctive. Volume fire meant to dominate the engagement zone. Tracers streaked through the grey sky, the sound of gunfire merging with the roar of engines. Sergeant Simmons recalled later, "We didn't aim. We just fired. The German fighters couldn't find a clear line. One by one, they went down. In less than a minute, several Fw-190s were trailing smoke, their pilots desperately trying to regain control. The Americans' method of firing first and adjusting on the fly created a lethal corridor that enemy aircraft simply could not navigate. Donnelly, maneuvering alongside a struggling B-17, intercepted a Bf-109 attempting a head-on attack. The P-38's nose guns spat continuous fire. Sparks erupted along the Bf-109's fuselage, and its climb stalled. The German pilot veered sharply, smoke streaming behind, narrowly avoiding a collision with another fighter. Moments later, it spun out of control and disappeared into the clouds. Amid the chaos, coordination within the squadron became crucial. Pilots and gunners communicated with terse, clipped commands, each movement synchronized by instinct and training. Captain Caldwell's voice cut across the radio. "Cover the bombers! Keep your angles tight." The Luftwaffe, despite their skill, could not match the Americans' aggressive, reflexive approach. Another wave of Fw-190s dove from above, attempting to break the bomber formation. This time, multiple gunners fired simultaneously without specific targeting, creating overlapping fields of fire. The result was catastrophic for the attackers. One Fw-190 disintegrated mid-air, pieces of fuselage trailing behind it like shrapnel from an unseen explosion. By noon, the air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning fuel. Bombers pressed on, battered but intact, shielded by P-38s that had become lethal walls of instinctive fire. For the first time, some pilots began to understand the psychological effect their method had on enemy aviators. German pilots hesitated, anticipating death at any angle. Donnelly's P-38 sustained minor damage from a flak burst near a heavily defended industrial target. Sparks flew from the wingtip, but the aircraft remained controllable. He adjusted course, keeping a tight line with the bomber formation, while keeping an eye out for remaining threats. Simmons, in the rear, unleashed another short instinctive burst that destroyed an Fw-190, attempting a surprise rear approach. The mission concluded with the bombers dropping their payloads and returning safely. Despite exhaustion and scattered injuries among the squadron, the effectiveness of instinctive high-volume fire was undeniable. In post-mission debriefings, pilots emphasized how reflexive action and volume fire had compensated for the numerical superiority of the Luftwaffe. Captain Caldwell summarized the operation in his report. Our gunners and pilots acted on training and instinct. The volume of fire, though uncontrolled in precision, achieved control over the engagement. Enemy losses are significant, bomber integrity maintained. We have demonstrated that sometimes, in the chaos of combat, action without hesitation is the decisive advantage. As the 339th returned to base, engines sputtering from the prolonged high-power maneuvers, there was a quiet sense of victory. The skies over Germany had once again proven lethal, not because of precision alone, but because of the combined reflexive action of men and machines, a method that would redefine the squadron's approach in the months to come. The following day, October 18, 1943, dawned cold and steel-grey over the Ruhr. After the previous day's intense encounters, the men of the 339th Fighter Squadron felt a mixture of anticipation and fatigue. Their aircraft had been patched and repaired overnight, engines meticulously checked, guns cleaned and reloaded. Yet the psychological weight of facing a disciplined Luftwaffe formation remained heavy. Captain Caldwell convened the briefing in the cramped operations hut. Maps of the Ruhr Valley, marked with industrial centres and flak positions, were spread across a table. Intelligence reported a coordinated German sortie. 2 full Gruppen of Fw-190s, approximately 30 aircraft, were expected to intercept the bomber stream. This was larger than anything they had faced in weeks. "The enemy knows we're coming," Caldwell began, voice low but steady. "We can't afford hesitation. Stay tight on the bombers. Trust your instincts. Fire first. Adjust second. Our gunners' reflexive action yesterday saved lives. Repeat that today." Lieutenant Donnelly nodded. He had memorized the enemy's attack patterns from the previous day: head-on passes, high-side dives, and coordinated rear assaults. The P-38s, though less maneuverable than the German fighters in a vertical dogfight, had the advantage of superior speed and armament. Each plane carried 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, concentrated in the nose, perfect for fast, lethal bursts. By 0730, the squadron took off, engines roaring, climbing through layers of fog and mist. The bomber stream was already visible below, heavily laden B-17 and B-24s, escorted by the 339th and other squadrons from the 13th Fighter Command. From the rear, gunners scanned constantly, eyes trained for the slightest flicker of an enemy aircraft. At 0900 hours, the first wave appeared over the distant industrial complexes. The Luftwaffe had anticipated the bombers' approach, converging from multiple directions. Fw-190s sliced through the clouds like knives, engines screaming, wings level and ready to pounce. "Bandits at 12 o'clock, diving fast." Caldwell's voice cut through the radio. Reflexive action took over. Pilots and gunners did not wait to acquire perfect aim. They unleashed controlled bursts as the enemy closed in. The sky lit with tracer fire, intersecting streams crisscrossing like deadly lattices. Sergeant Simmons fired without hesitation, his bursts creating a wall of lead. An Fw-190 trailing a bomber attempted to evade, but the concentrated machine gun fire tore through its fuselage. Flames erupted mid-air, and the aircraft spun downward, disintegrating before it reached the tree line. The Germans responded with disciplined aggression, attempting to exploit gaps in the formation. One staffel of Bf-109s broke from the main group and dove at a squadron of B-24s. Lieutenant Marks, flying slightly ahead, engaged a Bf-109 head-on. His 20mm cannon erupted, and the German aircraft shuddered under the impact. Smoke trailed as the pilot tried to recover, but he was too slow. Another burst, instinctively timed, ended the encounter. Amid the chaos, formations broke and reformed. Caldwell manoeuvred his squadron in tight defensive arcs, covering exposed bombers while anticipating enemy dives. The air vibrated with the combined sound of engines, gunfire, and explosions. Clouds of black smoke and twisted metal littered the sky, evidence of the Americans' unrelenting pressure. Despite their success, the squadron faced casualties. Lieutenant Jenkins' P-38 took a flak hit near the engine cowling, forcing him to limp back toward England. Donnelly's wingman, Lieutenant Rowe, experienced hydraulic failure after a near collision with a Bf-109. Both pilots executed emergency procedures, demonstrating the mix of training, skill, and luck required for survival. The decisive factor in the engagement remained the American approach. Rapid, instinctive fire. Pilots and gunners described later how aiming precisely was often impossible at high speeds, but suppressive fire and quick reflexes shattered the enemy's cohesion. German fighters, used to calculated maneuvers and precision attacks, found themselves overwhelmed by unpredictable bursts of fire that forced evasive action and fractured formations. Around 10:30 hours, the Luftwaffe began to retreat. Outnumbered and suffering heavy losses, they pulled back behind smoke and clouds, leaving the bomber stream largely intact. Squadron debriefs later reported that at least 12 enemy aircraft had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair, while American losses were minimal, a testament to the effectiveness of their reflexive tactics. Caldwell circled the bombers for one final pass, ensuring no stragglers were threatened. From above, the Ruhr Valley seemed eerily silent, smoke curling from smouldering factories and downed aircraft. Pilots felt a grim satisfaction. Survival in these skies was never guaranteed, but today their tactics had decisively protected the bombers. Back at the base, mechanics and gunners worked immediately to repair the battered P-38s, while intelligence officers catalogued enemy losses. Post-mission reports emphasized the importance of the instinctive fire strategy. Caldwell noted, "The enemy expected measured responses. They did not expect reflexive, high-volume fire from every angle. Our gunners' initiative, combined with pilot coordination, turned the tables on what could have been a devastating attack." By late afternoon, the 339th had landed, planes covered in oil streaks, smoke residue, and the occasional splintered wingtip. Exhausted, the pilots and gunners debriefed, recounting close calls and sudden bursts of survival instinct. Even in victory, there was a sober recognition of the chaos and unpredictability of air combat. Yet, despite the exhaustion, morale was high. The squadron understood that their tactics, learning to trust reflexes over perfect aim, had changed the nature of their engagements. German formations would now approach more cautiously, and the Americans had gained a psychological edge. Fear, confusion, and surprise were as lethal as bullets. The day's encounters would later be cited in squadron histories as a turning point, not for a single heroic act, but for the disciplined chaos of men and machines acting in unison, letting instinct and training guide them to victory. October 19, 1943, dawned pale and brittle over England. The air smelled of rain and burnt oil as the 339th Fighter Squadron prepared for another mission over the Ruhr. The previous day's triumph still resonated in the barracks. 12 German fighters destroyed, countless others damaged, and the bomber stream largely unscathed. Yet there was no room for complacency. Intelligence briefings had confirmed that the Luftwaffe would escalate efforts, employing larger formations and more aggressive tactics to counter the growing threat posed by the American escorts. Captain Caldwell moved through the hangars, inspecting aircraft and speaking with pilots and gunners. His presence, calm and focused, instilled confidence. "Remember," he said, stopping by Donnelly's P-38, "today is about keeping the bombers safe. Don't get distracted by the chase. Fire decisively, fire instinctively, and stay alive." The squadron took off at 07:15 hours, the engines of the P-38s screaming into the cold morning air. Clouds hung low over the channel, offering both cover and risk. As they climbed, the bomber stream of B-17 and B-24s appeared in the distance, forming a massive lumbering river of steel above the European landscape. Gunners scanned relentlessly, eyes darting for the telltale glint of German wings. By 08:45, radar and visual scouts reported a large formation of enemy fighters approaching from the north, nearly 40 Fw-190s, with Bf-109s circling above. The Luftwaffe intended to punch through the American defences and inflict maximum damage on the bombers. The pilots of the 339th understood the stakes. This engagement could decide the outcome of the Ruhr raids for weeks to come. The initial German attack began in a disciplined dive from high altitude. Pilots reported the familiar streak of black and white Focke-Wulfs cutting through the clouds, wings level, engines roaring. Gunners reacted immediately, unleashing a torrent of lead as enemy aircraft closed the distance. Observers later described the scene as a firestorm in the sky, tracers crisscrossing, the sound of engines and machine guns blending into a deafening roar. Lieutenant Marks, flying as wingman to Caldwell, noted how chaos had become a weapon in itself. "We couldn't wait to aim perfectly," he later recounted in debriefings. "By the time you lined up, they'd veered, pulled, or dived away. You had to fire instinctively, trust your training, and hope your gut didn't fail you." It was this instinctive firing that once again gave the Americans the edge. German fighters, expecting calculated and deliberate engagements, found themselves under continuous pressure from multiple angles. Each P-38's 4.50 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon created overlapping zones of fire. Enemy pilots reported in post-war interrogations that they were shocked at the sudden, unrelenting barrage, often seeing the flashes of gunfire before they could react. The result was immediate. Several Fw-190s went down in flames, wings sheared by concentrated bursts. One Bf-109, trailing a B-24, was hit in the engine and cockpit, spiralling into a smoke-streaked descent. Another enemy fighter, attempting a climbing maneuver, collided with its own wingman after evasive maneuvers forced a miscalculation. Chaos compounded chaos, and the Americans exploited it with disciplined aggression. Sergeant Simmons, positioned behind the lead bombers, fired rapidly at a closing Fw-190. "I didn't have time to aim," he later recalled, "but instinct told me where to put the bursts. The plane just erupted. The enemy aircraft broke apart mid-air, debris scattering across the sky. Observers on the bombers below saw the American gunners' reflexive technique as a shield, a sudden wall of lethal force that German pilots could not penetrate. As the battle unfolded, formations fragmented. Caldwell directed his squadron in weaving defensive patterns, covering exposed bombers while coordinating with adjacent units. Pilots executed split-second maneuvers, banking hard, diving, and climbing to intercept enemy aircraft before they could reach the vulnerable bombers. Communications crackled over the radio, terse and efficient. Bandits diving port side. "Gunners on the second wave, fire now. Break left, cover the B-24. Despite the intensity, losses were minimal on the American side. Lieutenant Rowe's P-38 took flak damage but remained controllable. A single bomber suffered a minor hit, but no crew members were injured. This was a stark contrast to the previous months, when Luftwaffe attacks frequently inflicted severe damage and casualties. The combination of reflexive gunners, coordinated tactics, and the P-38's firepower had begun to shift the air war in favour of the Allies. By 10:15 hours, the Luftwaffe began to retreat, battered and demoralised. Squadron debriefings later confirmed at least 15 enemy aircraft destroyed in the engagement, with several more damaged beyond repair. The bomber stream had completed its mission with minimal losses, a testament to the effectiveness of instinctive fire and cohesive squadron strategy. After returning to base, pilots and gunners shared stories of near misses and miraculous saves. They described a sky filled with fire and smoke, punctuated by the sudden silence when an enemy plane broke apart and fell into the Ruhr below. Mechanics and ordnance crews worked immediately to repair P-38s, while intelligence officers compiled detailed reports on enemy losses and tactics. Caldwell addressed the squadron once more. "Today proves that our method works. Fire instinctively, protect the bombers, and stay coordinated. The enemy is learning, but so are we. Every mission we survive, every bomber we protect, turns the tide." The events of October 18th to 19th became pivotal in USAAF records, highlighting a new approach to aerial engagement. Reflexive firing, disciplined chaos, and the concentrated firepower of the P-38s had shifted air superiority in the Allies' favour. German pilots reported heightened caution in subsequent missions, often avoiding frontal assaults or breaking off attacks prematurely. As evening fell, pilots gazed over the darkening landscape of England. The exhaustion was evident, but so was a quiet confidence. They had proven that instinct, training, and coordinated aggression could overcome even the most disciplined enemy formations. The Ruhr raids would continue, but now with the knowledge that American gunners could unleash lethal force without waiting for perfect aim.